I'm George Galloway, and I present Kalimahorra on Al Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. Kalimahorra means free word. That's what I speak. So Kalimahorra is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Al Mayadeen television. Welcome to Kalimahorra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen television, coming to you from London, but discussing the Black Sea. Why, you say? Well, only in June, the Royal Navy engaged in a clear provocation to try and draw the Russian defences around Crimea into action. We know that it was a provocation for two reasons. First of all, the Royal Navy had taken the precaution of bringing a BBC camera crew on board and a man from the Daily Mail, just in case you were in any doubt. And secondly, we now know that the British Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, advised against this risky manoeuvre in the Black Seas. The Defence Secretary pushed for it, and Prime Minister Boris Johnson sided with the Defence Secretary. The Russian response was predictable, at least predictable by anyone with any sense. They dropped depth charges, they dropped bombs from aeroplanes, they fired guns from the decks of their defending warships. The British naval ship, the HMS Defender, which is a Type 45 destroyer, the clue being in the name, came mighty close to an armed confrontation, extremely dangerous armed confrontation with a nuclear-armed superpower, namely Russia. Why did they do it? Who knows? Why did the Foreign Secretary oppose it? Because he knew, as Britain's diplomatic service must have told him, that no good could come of it. Why did the Defence Secretary want to do it? He did because in a few months there will be international war games involving the United States Navy, the British Navy, and the mighty Navy of the Netherlands, who will be engaging in exactly the same kind of provocation. So it was, in a way, a practice run. Anyway, enough from me. I'm just the enthusiastic amateur here. I'm joined, as always, by my guests who are seasoned professionals and distinguished experts, starting with the former Mayor of London, twice Mayor of London, former Labour Member of Parliament, sat in Parliament with me and one of our other guests, our third guest not yet been elected to Parliament. But we'll start with the former Mayor of London, Ken Livingston. Ken, what was this all about? Am I right to describe it as a provocation?
Absolutely, and we've had this all our lives. I remember going back through the Cold War, incidents like this again, because a Prime Minister wants to be seen as this strong, powerful person, and it usually, sadly, boosts their ratings in the polls. But what makes me so angry about this is the British public aren't told the truth. The simple fact is Russia took control of the Crimea because 90% of the people living in Crimea were Russians. Crimea had never been part of Ukraine until 1955, when the then Russian leader, who was actually a Ukrainian himself, Khrushchev, he changed the borders. Now, that didn't make a great deal of difference then because they're all in Russia. But now, I think the simple fact is, if the people of Ukraine have got to accept the fact you can't take over and control a completely different community. It's like you just think all around the world, we've screwed this up. You think of the Kurds. When Britain and France, after World War I, carved up the Middle East, there was the Kurdish nation, but they were carved up into 4 separate countries and denied. And so all the history of Western imperialism has been about screwing everything up for our own interest. Well, not the interest of the public, but the large corporations.
And of course, the only reason there was any question of the people of Crimea voting to adhere to Mother Russia was that the West had sponsored a violent coup d'etat in Ukraine, which drove out the elected government and promptly, its first act actually, promptly declare Russian to be no longer an official language in the state. So I guess these people in Crimea could see what was coming if they remained.
And it's happened again and again. I mean, Britain has often supported America in overthrowing democratically elected regimes because they're progressive and they're opposing American imperialism. And this has just gone on all over the world and all through our lives. And I just think Britain should keep out of getting caught up in America's foreign policy.
Jacques Arnold, we were all together, I think, in Parliament. You were a Conservative. You are, I don't think I'm insulting you by saying you are a fervent monarchist. I'm guessing you're backing the Royal Navy on this occasion.
Because Crimea was a country or an area that the Moscow government decided to switch to Ukraine, but not before they had kicked out into the camps of Siberia the original Tatar population, and completely changed the matter, and they transferred it to the Ukraine, which quite naturally the area developed along with the remainder of Ukraine until this unwarranted Russian invasion, no doubt encouraged by their need for the port at Sevastopol. But to say...
Well, the Navy has always been there, of course.
Yes, because of course it was inheritance of the ancient ships of the Soviet Navy. When Ukraine separated from the Russian Federation, thanks to 1955 and the machinations of the Stalinist regime, the population had changed, and it was in the Ukraine rather than in the Russian Federation.
Now, Ken Livingston says the Prime Minister always wants to look strong and so on, but how strong do you look sending one destroyer, which the Russian Navy could have sunk with great ease?
But that's precisely the point. The ship was in transit between the Ukrainian port and the Georgian port. It took the short route through Ukrainian waters. The fact that against the wishes of the United Nations and most
not the United Nations,
most worldwide, because Russia would exercise a veto. That's why.
Well, I just want to correct you. It's
anyway,
not
those waters
Nations.
are Ukrainian. They're not recognised by Britain and, let's say, most other worldwide countries. Mm-hmm. The ship was making a short transit, but quite frankly, if you tussle with one of these modern destroyers, it will be quite interesting to see what the result might have been. Thank God we didn't have to wait to have a result.
What do you think might have been the result? Are you really prepared for war with nuclear superpower Russia over the right to send ships across the Black Sea?
I don't think it would come to nuclear war, and it didn't come to nuclear war, and that was
a war at all. Are you prepared to fight Russia for this right?
Specifically the point. What you're saying is, should we allow the bully boy who took over the Crimea and took it away from its own country should be able to prevail?
Well, on the subject of bully boys, let's talk about Britain's history, if you would like. I'm not sure that ascribing the term bully boy to other countries quite befits us, but my point is, and I ask you for the third time, are you ready to fight a war with Russia to assert your right to sail across that channel in the Black Sea?
No, because I don't think that would arise. The Russians realised it wouldn't be a good idea and it would provoke war, and they therefore didn't interfere with the transit, which I stressed it was on the high seas in Ukrainian sovereign waters.
Why do they bring the BBC and the Daily Mail with them? Is that normal on Royal Navy ships?
It's not abnormal in as much as you said that the British people wanted to know what was happening in defence. That's precisely how they do know, by journalists being present who are not necessarily popular with the crew, but it's a necessary thing in a democracy. Can you imagine the Russian forces allowing the media in and broadcasting to the Russian people?
Actually, they do all the time, but never mind. Ella Rule, you are a communist, in fact, the chair of the Communist Party here in Britain. I'm assuming, maybe wrongly, that you take Russia's point of view on this?
Oh, certainly, yes. There's so much been said, but one thing that certainly struck me, you know, if 90% of the population decided to go back to Russia, why would we not respect that view? You know, I was thinking that if Scotland, by a single vote, decides to leave the UK and to be part of the EU, we would respect that. But if it's Russia or a country that's been labelled as an enemy, then acquires a territory by a 90% vote, then you have to say, oh, well, we don't recognise that. Well, why would we not recognise it? And as you quite rightly said, it happened after a democratically elected government in Ukraine was overthrown by a coup that was paid for, sponsored by US imperialism and its allies. And that being the case, I mean, you know, why would one interfere with what was a democratic decision? I'm just astonished. I really am astonished that people would be so brazen about that. With regard to Russia, I was thinking, in our garden, we have a fox that comes and visits regularly. It likes to sun itself in the sun. And recently, 2 magpies have been coming to peck at it and irritate it. And this struck me as very much the same. There's Russia sitting there, and these little countries like Ukraine and Britain come along and have a little peck. Well, the fox, most of the time, takes no notice. Every so often it gets fed up, wags its tail, and then the birds all fly off. And I really think this is what's happening here. Of course, it's not quite as simple as that. It's not, you know, little people trying to show how big and brave they are. They've definitely been put up with to it by the United States, and it's in anticipation of war games that are going to be taking place in the Black Sea, as you quite rightly say, in the not too distant future. And another issue to take into account is what this defender was doing in the area. It had been in Ukraine and was the venue for a signing ceremony where our British industry was mobilised to provide warships for the Ukraine at a cost of several £billion. And isn't it lovely to think how many British jobs that would have saved, you know? So really, this is the context.
It is, the point you make is not extraneous. It is rather odd, having walked out of the European Union and endured the enmity of 27 European countries, that we seem to be trying so hard to alienate further, not just Russia, but Russia and China at the same time. Do we want to be the Millwall FC of international relations? No one likes us, we don't care.
I think it's really because we miss being a big imperial power and, you know, being the one that calls the shots. Well, we can't do that anymore. But we sit on the coattails of US imperialism and, you know, we enjoy being part of the winning team. Or
and yet their president doesn't seem to like us very much.
No,
what could possibly go wrong? Dr. Jim Jennings from Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States, is the president of Conscience International. He's a famous podcaster and has responded to wars and natural disasters all over the world. Let's hear from Dr. Jim.
You're welcome.
What impact will the escalation of tensions have in the Black Sea region?
I think it would be a mistake to consider the recent naval incident in the Black Sea as a one-off or just Putin being Putin. No, it's far more significant than that because it has ramifications for the future and, of course, reaching far back in history. I am a former history professor, and two things cannot be changed. One is geography, the other is history. And we're dealing with the Eurasia landmass. We speak of two continents, Europe and Asia, but in fact, it's one landmass with reaching from Great Britain to Japan, with Europe being only 4 million square miles out of 21 million square miles. But where is the dividing line? That brings in the question of history. The last 3 centuries have not been very good to this region because of the conflict over where the eastern line to divide Europe from Asia will happen. And that's complicated in our day by the oil and gas reserves in the Black Sea and Caspian Sea basin. So it's very, very significant. You go back to the 19th century, the Congress of Vienna in 1815 tried to put a line there, and it lasted for a while. World War I, the Battle of Gallipoli, World War II, the Great Battle of Stalingrad, were concentrated in this general region. Why? Because of the great oil reserves. Europe is thirsty for oil, like a baby denied suckling at its mother's breast. The prosperity and life of Europe is dependent on the oil and gas that comes from spheres controlled by Russia. But guess what? The Black Sea Economic Cooperation Council does not cooperate with the Caspian Sea Economic Cooperation Council. There are 7 nations on the one Black Sea region. There are, and freedom of navigation should be guaranteed by international law, but the Caspian Sea has 5 nations surrounding it, but Russia is dominant in both those areas. And so all the oil pipelines that have been negotiated and developed over the last 20 years, and they're not finished, are about the prosperity of Russia, the prosperity of Europe, and the prosperity, in a way, of the United States as well. So that entire region is fraught with history and historical consequences. And of all the places on Earth which are important for the coming 2 decades, economically, in terms of politics and risk of war, this region of the Black Sea, Caspian Sea, the South China Sea, and the Persian Gulf are the 3 greatest dangers.
Could this be Britain just asserting itself on the world stage after Brexit?
Well, I don't know the details of that, but it's difficult to believe that it was not coordinated. I don't think the recent trip of Mr. Biden to NATO was any accident, that he met with NATO and with his European allies before meeting with Russia. So there are things going on at the level of the U.S. military councils. I'm speaking particularly of the Pentagon now, that I think are relevant to this whole discussion. One reason is that the United States has recently withdrawn its troops from Afghanistan. Why did, after 20 years, the U.S. want to withdraw suddenly from Afghanistan? That's an unwinnable war, of course, but there may be a reason that there are far more important areas of the world to defend, with the U.S. Naval strength and military strength and coordination with NATO.
Does this incident escalate the Russian-Ukraine standoff?
I do think that we are facing a gradual escalation. It takes time to form these councils. It took 20 years to form the Caspian Sea Economic Cooperation Council and or group, and the pipelines take time to develop. So it's a slow escalation, but it's almost inevitable that there will be a conflict there. It would take a miracle to avoid a conflict in the next 20 years because of the as I said, the economic prosperity of Europe and of Russia and of North America are connected with the great energy reserves that are in that area.
Was this a deliberate act of provocation by the British and American governments?
It is that the NATO alliance, which originally consisted of 14 nations and is now 28 nations, has been pushing eastward against Russia since the fall of the Soviet Union. And that scares the Russians, and they insist on pushing back. So in a way, Putin is correct to push back, but Ukraine is in the middle and the most important issue. Crimea has already been seized in 2014 by Putin, and nobody did anything to stop him because it's in his sphere of influence. Eastern Ukraine is under assault by Russia. So whose fault is it? Well, it always starts with somebody doing something, and Ukraine wants to be in NATO to save its life, and the Western Alliance wants to add NATO, but not at the expense of fighting Russia. So both sides are to blame, and that's how wars start.
And finally, are you optimistic about tensions calming down in the near future?
I am what somebody has called a pess-optimist. I'm both pessimistic and optimistic. In the short term, I'm optimistic because I don't think anybody's so foolish as to start something right now. They're not ready. But something is happening. And in the long term, I'm pessimistic. As I said, I don't see how in the next 20 years a major conflict can be avoided in that region. We in the U.S. Academics for Peace hope for peace, and we work for it, but I wouldn't put any money on it.
Wow. We'll get reaction to all of that after the break. Stay tuned. You're watching Kalimahora with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen Television. We're coming to you from London, but we're discussing the Navy, the British Navy, and its summer jamboree in the Black Sea. Ken Livingston, Ella Rule's analogy or metaphor about the magpies poking the fox was a very good one, except while we may be magpies, Russia's not just a fox. It is historically a bear. How risky is the magpie's behavior in these war games?
It's always clearly risky. And I think back my entire life since the end of the Second World War, the times we came close, like at the Cuban Missile Crisis and so on. The trouble is that Russia's not really in a position where it can trigger that, because right the way through all this 3/4 of a century, America's military stockpile dwarfs what was the Soviet Union and is now Russia. I mean, Russian leaders, whether they were communists or now Putin, know if they launch an attack on America, they're going to get smashed, and that's the reality. And so most of the conflicts that we've come close to have been around, colonial issues, like when Britain and France back in 1956 invaded Egypt and so on. All of it is about our financial interests. All these involvements in the Middle East, it's about oil. Literally, if you think back, 1953, a democratically elected government in Iran is overthrown by a coup planned by America and Britain. Why? Because that government had nationalised their oil, and that had been taken over from British and American firms. That's what it's all about. It was, to overthrow a democratically elected government because they take control of their own economy, it's outrageous.
Jacques, you guffawed during the American academics treatise. I infer you don't buy it. Tell us why.
Well, the two things he said that were highly significant. First was he said there should be freedom of navigation in the Black Sea. That is precisely what the Royal Navy was doing. And
I think he said freedom of navigation for the countries of the Black Sea. Not for the Royal Navy. What business have they got in the Black Sea?
they were calling on the Ukrainian port for the reasons that you mentioned earlier, and they were on the way to Georgia to see a friendly power in Georgia, and they were navigating by the shortest route. And the other thing the professor said was he hinted there was some kind of American complicity. Well, what's significant, there was not only the Royal Navy ship in the Ukrainian port, there was an American one. And the American one decided it was not going to take the direct route for fear of any potential consequences, which rather disproves the idea that the Americans were involved in this.
Doesn't it prove we're stark raving mad? We're prepared to take risks that even the Americans are not prepared to take?
To take risks to navigate through water through which they were entitled to navigate and which are not Russian waters.
Come now,
they are
Jack.
Ukrainian waters.
Jacques, you know very well that a hostile military, a navy of a hostile power, does not have freedom of navigation to enter the territorial waters of another country.
That is the point. They are not the territorial waters of Russia. They are the territorial waters of the Ukraine.
Well, you used
the fact that Russia, by force of arms, took over Crimea does not make it right.
Well, you
that
used
they
to be a
held
pragmatic
Crimea,
sort in
let
foreign
alone the
affairs.
waters.
Isn't it the pragmatic British way to recognise those who have effective control of a territory? That's, after all, why we continued to support Pol Pot in Cambodia.
I don't know about Pol Pot. What I do know is that the international community does not recognise the Russian forcible occupation of Crimea, which incidentally follows on what they did to the Tatars, the original population.
You're going back some now.
Of Crimea. Well, I may be going back, but I'm sure the Crimean people, the Tatars, who
Plenty
were sent,
of Tatars
who
now
was, who were sent
in
to
Crimea. I've met
who
them.
were sent to the camps.
I've dined with them. Ella, isn't the new factor here? I mean, Ken makes the point that Russia would be smashed, but isn't the new point here that the ever closer military, political, and economic closeness between Russia and China, doesn't that make the equation different? An attack on China would be treated by Russia as an attack on her, and vice versa. America would still have more rockets than both China and Russia, but the world's economy would come to an end in the event of a confrontation like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think alliance between Russia and China is the biggest guarantee of peace, because it really would be very dangerous to try and attack them. But the necessities of the situation. Before the First World War, it was realised how suicidal it would be, to go to war, how expensive, and lots of people opposed it and said it would never happen. But the despair felt by the powers that went into that war, that if they didn't do that, they were dead, that was what drove it, even though it was the most ridiculous thing in the world to do. And I think this is the situation we find ourselves in now. The rising economic power of China is seen as a threat to all the various multinationals that have been making massive profits. And here's China coming along and beating them at their own game. They don't like it. And the very valid points made by the speaker from America about the oil and the need to control those very essential commodities that the wealth of the world depends on. And so you get Britain, America, all these countries coming out of the pandemic. They've outspent themselves. There's going to be massive inflation. It's going to cause economic chaos. And this is a kind of situation which drives people mad and drives them to war. And this is why I would agree with the analysis that, unfortunately, a war is likely to happen unless we can persuade people not to support any such thing. Point out that China's not threatening anyone militarily. Russia's not threatening anyone militarily. It is not in their interest to have a war any more than it is ours. But there are sections in our society that are desperate for war. But that doesn't really apply to them. And I think what we need to do is to get people to say, well, we will not have a war. And we've recently been looking at the pictures of what's happened to poor old Gaza being bashed to smithereens. Do we really want that to happen to our English cities? Well, we don't. We keep out of war. Nobody wins a war except those people who stay out of it.
You see, what this is about is China's economy is growing so dramatically, it's on course to overtake America, become the largest economy in the world. And that, for American politicians, they are having trouble with this because, literally for a century, America's been the predominant global economy and military power. That's coming to an end. And I think there's a real danger that more and more American politicians will want to get involved in these sort of things to try and trigger some sort of setback for China. I think they're much more worried about China than they are about Russia.
Now, let's hear from a man who knows, the Honourable Craig Murray, former British ambassador to Uzbekistan, who was sacked by the Tony Blair government for, and I'm quoting, over-focusing on human rights, unquote. He's a long-standing Foreign Office official, but now a rather trenchant critic of British foreign policy. Craig Murray, welcome.
Thank you.
Craig, let's get to the heart of this matter. How dangerous was Britain's standoff with Russia in the Black Sea?
Well, I think you could certainly say it's extremely foolish, reckless, misguided, and obviously could lead to a live fire situation where people could get injured or killed, and you're doing that in a war zone where these things can escalate. So I don't want to exaggerate the chances of actual hostile action happening. It's maybe unlikely because the military, by and large, are quite adept at handling such situations. But it's a risk you don't need to take. And of course, other than the immediate risk, there's what it does to international relations and why you are trying to start a new Cold War and to stoke up tension and cause unnecessary hostility. It's really quite a remarkable thing to do, and it does run completely unnecessary risks.
What's your take as a former Foreign Office official on the claim that this was unexpectedly an issue between Britain and Russia, that it was actually quite an innocent journey?
I think there's no doubt that this was a deliberate provocation, that the British government was infringing on the territorial sea of Crimea in order to provoke Russia and make some reaction and make some kind of provocation and political display. Precisely why or to what end, it's rather difficult to fathom, because there are no immediate good effects from this, but it's part of a general determination to portray Russia as the enemy and in some sense some kind of threat to the United Kingdom.
Could it be a simple error of judgment?
No, I don't think it can be an error of judgment. I mean, to sail within the territorial sea on a modern warship with modern navigational aids is not something you can do by mistake. And in fact, of course, the BBC journalist on board was giving a running commentary on the deliberate provocation and saying that they were going to enter the territorial sea and see how the Russians reacted. Plainly, it was a planned provocation.
How dangerous is this incident for future relations between Britain and Russia, or have we abandoned hope of any relations with Russia?
Well, I think you have degrees of risk and degrees of probability. I think the risk that it would ignite a third world war is extremely low. But on the other hand, why would you want to start any risk of igniting a third world war that could destroy mankind. So any act that can lead to that, any act of provocation that can lead to the possibility of that kind of outcome is crazy. Why would you provoke a nuclear power? It's an extraordinary thing to do, and it achieved nothing. There was no purpose to it other than to cause diplomatic pressure. And you must remember that there still is active fighting in Ukraine between Ukrainian and Russian-backed forces. So you are carrying out this provocation not in a peaceful area, but in an area where active fighting has been happening. That obviously much increases the chances of armed reaction, which could escalate. So plainly, I think it's very easy to say, oh, it could lead to nuclear war and exaggerate that danger. It's a low risk, but why would anybody want to take any risk at all of such a thing?
Could the incident be interpreted as Britain merely seeking to assert itself on the world stage?
I think the governing classes in the UK, let me put it that way, and particularly the military and the security services, they need an enemy. They always need to have an enemy to justify the vast sums of money put into the armaments industry, put into the military, put into the security services. And the truth of the matter is that the United Kingdom, Great Britain, doesn't actually have an enemy. There is no country on this earth that is considering invading the United Kingdom. There is no country that wants to go to war with the United Kingdom. Russia has no intention whatsoever of invading the United Kingdom. In that situation, it's quite difficult to justify the billions and billions and billions of so-called defense spending when there's nothing to defend against. So, of course, the military always have to create an enemy, to create incidents, to create a threat. It's a bit like when we were told that Saddam Hussein could attack the UK in 40 minutes, which was complete and utter nonsense, but was part of his business of creating an enemy in order to justify the vast sums of expenditure that go into the military and the armaments industry. And that's what this is about.
Is it possible that this could be a fabricated action between the UK and the US?
I think it's extremely unlikely that the UK would do this without notifying the US first that they are going to do it. And we're seeing rather similar UK-US action being planned for the South China Seas, for example, where they intend similarly to assert claims to territorial water. And one thing I haven't said, which I would like to add, is this is a legal activity. This is entering a territorial sea for the purposes of conducting propaganda, which is specifically outlawed in the law of the sea, in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. You're not allowed to enter somebody else's territorial sea in order either to investigate their defenses, which is something which was being done, or to conduct propaganda. That's specifically outlawed. So this is a legal activity, and in concert with the US, they are planning rather similar activity for the South China Seas in the coming months. So yes, this is a concerted thing.
And finally, is that it, or might we see similar incidents occurring in the near future?
Yeah, I think we are going to see more of this. The UK's recent defence paper, its defence posture, emphasised naval activity and emphasised the need to increase naval activity to the east of the Mediterranean. Why on earth the United Kingdom would do that, I have no idea. What happens east in the Mediterranean is none of our business, let alone what happens east of the Mediterranean. This is a return to imperial delusions and dreams of being a great empire able to send military ships around the world to dictate what happens in other countries. And it's a dangerous and expensive delusion, unfortunately, which the British government has fallen into. And I do think we are going to see more of it.
Jacques Arnold, if this was all such a good idea, why did the British Foreign Secretary oppose it?
For reasons of not wanting to run a risk. The problem that the British government had was that it was quite correct that a ship travelling from the Ukrainian to the Georgian port took the short route through Ukrainian waters in order to do so. And I think the other significant point was the fact that there was no military reaction. Whatever the Russian government told its people through the media, the facts of the matter, there were no depth charges anywhere near the Royal Navy ship, and likewise the gunfire was literally miles away, involved with the previously announced military exercise by the Russian authorities, who had in fact notified in the appropriate international means of that this was going to take place. So I think the most significant thing is that there was no reaction to the passage of the Royal Navy ship, and the Royal Navy ship did in fact establish the rights of navigation on the high seas.
So the Foreign Secretary was lacking in moral fibre?
The Foreign Secretary perhaps responded in the way the Foreign Office always has done.
I think he's saying they're cowards.
Yes. I mean, the simple fact is, though, I mean, all through my life, through the Cold War and the situation we've now got, we've been lied to, and it's not just our governments on the other side. It takes years for the truth to come out. I remember, the first American presidential election, I remember Kennedy gets elected in 1960, promising to close the nuclear missile gap with the Soviet Union. He gets his first briefing after he's elected by the Pentagon. They say, oh, don't worry about that. We've got 300 missiles, they've only got 6. And if a person on the edge of becoming the next American president doesn't know anything about this, I mean, how can we believe almost anything we hear from governments? I certainly don't believe anything I've ever heard from Boris Johnson.
Quite. Now, the BBC, of course, were clear and clearly in contradiction to what Jacques just said, because they said the Russians were firing just over their head. Craig Murray's point is that while the risk may have been low, what if something had gone wrong? What if someone's finger slipped on a trigger? What if a trajectory was not properly calibrated? When you've got all this build-up of military hardware in war zones, anything can happen.
Yeah, mistakes get made. And then the simple fact is that could have triggered something. And we could have seen then, with the response from the Russians, our battleship might have been sunk. I mean, that would be something rather difficult for the government to come to terms with. But what's going to be our response? We're going to go to war with Russia? No, we're not. We just should keep out of all this nonsense. There's always a risk. And it might not be a catastrophic risk that's going to tip us into war, but it's putting the lives of our soldiers and sailors out there at risk.
Ella, the Yangtze incident in which the Red Chinese Navy sank a British frigate, I think it was, almost brought about war. And we now know from recently released papers that actually the Cuban Missile Crisis was not the closest that we came to war. The United States government was seriously pressed by its military brass to launch a preemptive nuclear attack on China before China got the bomb. A Yangtze incident this could well have been, couldn't it?
Yes, I'm afraid it could have done. But, I think Putin is a person of enormous sang-froid. He's not going to get himself panicked into doing anything crazy. And I think this is why it was unlikely that anything would happen. Now, what they have done, what Russia has done as a result of this incident, to say, well, don't try it again. You got away with it more or less this time. But if it happens again, we can't guarantee that we won't drop a bomb on the ship and sink it. And so it has given Russia the opportunity of making it clear that this is not acceptable. Now, this whole idea that this was an innocent journey, of course, this was blown sky high by the soggy package found at the bus stop, wasn't it? Where they opened it up and found that there had been deliberations as to whether it was worthwhile, risking the reception committee that they would get. So this whole idea that it was just an innocent short
journey from A to B, the shortest way.
And this shortest way involved being inside the territorial waters for 4 minutes. 4 minutes. So easy to have avoided any provocation if they could take the shortest way and just have a little detour which wouldn't even have taken an extra 10 minutes. It was obviously, if we hadn't got all the documentary proof necessary in this mysterious soggy bag that appeared at the bus stop, then perhaps we would have believed them. But one thing that the soggy bag tells us, that you cannot believe what you're told. We were told quite specifically that it was an innocent exercise of the rite of passage. Can a warship ever innocently do that anyway? A warship is a warship is a warship. But in actual fact, it was proved to be a lie that it was innocent. It never was innocent. It was
a curious case, that one, Jacques, and in your old stamping ground. What were top secret MOD documents doing sitting at a bus stop in Kent?
I haven't the faintest idea. What I do know is we cannot just sit passively and accept countries taking over part of their neighbours, as Russia has done with Crimea, Russia has done with Georgia, because it was precisely those takeovers that in the 1930s, the takeovers of Austria, Czechoslovakia, ended up in war.
So you are ready to fight then?
That is what the danger is.
You are ready to fight.
The danger is don't shut your eyes and saying whatever the Russians do is inevitable and no business of ours. It's precisely because it is a business of the international community.
90% of the people in Crimea are Russian.
Unlike Iraq, nearby Iraq, where we travelled thousands of miles to occupy that country.
It is filled with Russians put there by the Soviet Union in its day in place of the Tatars who were sent to the Gulag camps and died.
Very wrong, but they're there now. Generations have grown up that never lived anywhere else.
And they quite happily lived as participants in the Republic of the Ukraine.
Until the coup. Jacques, I wanted to ask, in the 19th century, when I suspect you would have been a terrific parliamentarian, Britain had a reputation for intelligent foreign policy, alliances, dividing and ruling other potential foes, having no permanent friends, only permanent interests. Now, here we have a situation where we've fallen out with 27 European Union countries, and we're staging military provocations, first in the Black Sea, and then in the South China Sea. This isn't very smart politics, is it? Everyone in the world, it seems, is being alienated by us. What do we gain from that?
Far from it, because the Royal Navy operates as part of the NATO alliance, which includes, incidentally, Black Sea powers like Bulgaria and Romania, and with the authorities in Ukraine, who patently resent the usurpation of their territory in the Crimea.
Well, you didn't answer my bigger point. We'll have to bring you back. We do have a situation where Britain has very few friends in the world. And we now have a president in the White House who plainly doesn't like Britain very much at all. That all adds up to a situation of isolation by Britain. Well done, Boris Johnson. Well done, the Secretary of State for Defence. Well done, the HMS defender. I've been George Galloway. My guests have been expert as always, and you have been a marvellous audience. Thank you very much for watching.